Mushroom Hour. Today on Mushroom Hour, we have the blessing to interview Benjamin Lillibridge. Benjamin is the founder of Big Island-based Mālama Mushrooms, a business focused on bringing superfood mushroom extracts to the masses for immunity, brain health, and energy support. As a part of Malama, he is working on characterizing and preserving the native mushrooms of Hawaii, as well as empowering local farmers to cultivate these wonderful mushrooms. As one of the most geologically diverse and isolated landmasses in the world, the unique ecology of plants, birds, insects, and amphibians in the Hawaiian Islands have attracted scientists from all over the world, resulting in thousands of new discoveries. However, the fungal realm has not received nearly the same attention. With many novel medicinal or therapeutic chemical compounds contained within fungi and mushrooms, what mysteries and potential breakthroughs have we been overlooking as they lie humbly at our feet? Join us as we dig deep into the mushrooms of Hawaii and the medicinal potential of the fungi kingdom on every level. Benjamin, it's great to have you on the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Darren.
I was really excited to have you on and get your perspective about mushrooms in a place like Hawaii. Whenever you think of an island environment, the diversity, the unique things that you get are always incredible. And I've just not heard a lot about mushrooms in Hawaii, so I'm really excited.
Yeah, and let me first just acknowledge you for creating such an awesome platform and sharing your journey in the mushroom world with everybody. It's really rad, and your authenticity and sincereness and passion for exploring the unknown and just educating yourself and sharing that with others is very cool. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for being part of it. You hit it right on the head. This is mostly an education of myself. I'm kind of bringing people along with me. Yeah, I couldn't do it without people like you being willing to come on. Before we jump into everything Hawaii, everything mushrooms, Malama, also the Clarity Project, the work you're doing with psilocybin down there, why don't we start a little bit with how it all started? How you maybe found yourself in Hawaii, maybe how you got into mushrooms. I don't know which came first, but a little bit of the tale of Benjamin here.
So yeah, keeping it brief, I grew up in Wisconsin in the forest and farmland up there, and always had a passion for the outdoors, recreated out there. And when I finally went to university in upstate New York, I wanted to figure out a way to preserve these natural places and that I've come to love. So I studied environmental science, had a focus on food systems as well, because I had become a bit disenfranchised with the industrial food system. So I kind of had this dual whammy of environmental science and agriculture that I was starting to explore in university. And around that same time, I had three significant experiences that kind of shaped my passion for mycology and mushrooms, which I'm sure a lot of people share the similar origin story of Uncle Paul Stamets' first TED Talk, the
Yep.
Ways Mushrooms Could Save the World. That was like, I remember watching that in my dorm room, just being like, what? Like, I had no idea. Then subsequently had my first psilocybin experience, which, to say the least, was pretty significant. And we'll talk a little bit more about that compound later. Finally, cultivating my first mushrooms in my dorm room closet. So those were kind of like the first things that really opened me up to the mycology world. And around that same time, I'd finished university, had a bout with Lyme disease, and just wanted to move to a place where I could have a significant impact in food systems. And Hawaii, with a year-round growing season, a very unique terroir with 8 of the world's 13 climate subzones, from monsoons to tundra to desert, seemed like a very unique place to kind of start that journey. I also had a few significant friends that were from there and had very much inspired me to check it out. So I moved there right after I finished university and kind of immediately jumped into mushrooms and farming and general food systems. I specifically started on a 90-acre industrial algae farm growing spirulina, and then kind of backtracked into a small aquaponics farm where I was doing a work trade, living in a mango tree on the property, and just began kind of reading mycelium running at night and studying all the old shroomery forums on how to cultivate, and ended up actually using a lava tube cave on the property as a fruiting chamber, and began the first iteration of Mālama Mushrooms, which was that small mushroom farm on that property.
What an amazing story. I mean, there's a lot in there. I think it's so funny how many people, because I saw that same '08 or whatever it was, TED Talk by Paul Stamets, that activated so many people. And obviously, I don't know how many, it's like 95% of people had an early formative experience with psilocybin that really opened them up to all mushrooms beyond just psilocybin, but it's like that potent breaking down the door that introduces you to the kingdom. I have a feeling, living in Wisconsin and then upstate New York, you probably got sick of the cold and snow. So Hawaii is not a bad place to go. But that image of Benjamin up in a mango tree reading Mycelium Running, I think that's kind of like a dream for a lot of people. That's really awesome. So I guess with the ecological zones being so unique in Hawaii, I would imagine they have a pretty unique food and farming system, with such a potentially, and I don't know, you can tell us, a dependence on the mainland. What is a little bit just about that diverse food system you run into in Hawaii?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. So despite having the year-round growing season in Hawaii, it does have a severe dependency on imports. The statistics are roughly Hawaii imports 80% of its food, and its main agricultural export is actually seed corn for big biotech firms like Syngenta and Monsanto's, things like that.
Not our favorite.
Not our favorite. And like, that's a whole nother podcast on the implications of that, the pesticide use. But it's funnier. It's like, it's the seed corn. So it's just they grow the corn out to seed to plant in the Midwest for the corn belt out there. So So anyway, there's a huge potential here, and it's definitely not an issue of land. Like, there's plenty of land. The current population of the Big Island that I live on used to be supported by just what could be grown here or fished here, stuff like that. So the potential is definitely there. And despite it having a lot of, we get snow on top of Mauna Kea, Mauna Loa, so there's that's not really prime ag land up there, but there's absolutely plenty out here. And for mushrooms, it's a year-round ambient fruiting chamber in a way, in a lot of places, with like a ripe humidity and temperature to do that. So
that's what I was about to ask, is adding mushrooms into that mix would seem to be a great way to meet a lot of the needs on the island, potentially for protein and that kind of thing. But you just hit on one of the big questions I had, which was whether or not Hawaii had enough room, had enough arable land. Because I've been to the Big Island, I don't know how good some of the areas that are formed gradually from the kind of the volcanic processes, when you get those whole fields that are basically, that lava rock, does that gradually turn its way into arable land? And is there enough room for people to really grow what they need?
For sure. In some ways, yeah. Like, left to its own natural processes, a lot of that barren lava landscape we'd need probably a few hundred years, and at least just to make that usable for ag. But in those lava fields, there's actually some impressive operations. Like, that's where that 90-acre spirulina farm, algae farm is.
Sure.
It's like in the Kona Desert on the lava rock. They've just made what's called raceway ponds, which is like a big racetrack, but it's a shallow pond with a paddle wheel, just like moving the algae. There's definitely ways to kind of hack the land. Like, if the land itself, the soil itself isn't quite ready, there's still ways to use it. And there's definitely an increase in people composting and kind of planting some of the initial trees that are good for breaking through that lava rock, which can then create a nice little ecosystem. It's definitely possible. And besides that, there's still plenty of land that isn't barren lava field that is still prime. Yeah.
Sounds ripe for exploration of maybe some new permaculture practices. And in your case, maybe using the lava tubes to grow mushrooms. That's a great story of how the company began. I do want to talk about Malama. So you started out as a mushroom farm. What were you growing at first? And how did you kind of settle on this focus of medicinals, and kind of how this started for you?
Yeah, so I started with oysters, just like everybody else does. They're carnivorous, and you have a lot more margin of error. So anybody just beginning to explore cultivation, I highly recommend some oyster species.
Right.
So yeah, I just studied that along with I think I mentioned the Shroomery Forum, like Roger Rabbit and some of these old heads and all their texts. And then slowly introduced some Reishi strains and lion's mane strains and kind of expanded from there. But it wasn't crazy long until I realized I was kind of in over my head as far as farming goes. And I knew I could figure it out, but after like doing the farm life for many years, I was feeling that I'd be a little bit more effective kind of on the front lines of things and wanting to educate and travel and spread my message that way. Kind of realized after doing a Kickstarter for the farm that I didn't reach my goal. I was like, if I had a product, I wouldn't need to fundraise. I wouldn't have to use Kickstarter. I could just simply market and sell my products and use a portion of that to kind of support my mycological mission.
It's a platform.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of when I jumped into what is called like value-added products, of working with other farmers and manufacturers and turning their products into our own elixirs or blends under our branding to spread our message more effectively and then funnel that into our mission.
It's proven to be a good mechanism for you to do some of these other things like the Hawaii Mycoflora project, like the Clarity project. So really kind of mission achieved. You might not have been able to do that if you were working on getting a farm up and running with such a huge investment, capital, equipment, and assuming you were using some of your own strains, equipment and time needed in a lab, creating a sterile environment, all those different processes take a lot of time and attention. So yeah, I can see why you'd start a product to really center on a mission more about education and dissemination.
Yeah, I'm glad you acknowledged that. And I would say too, it was kind of where my strength was too. Like if I felt like I was built for the cultivation full-time life, I would have leaned into that. But I was definitely I had experience with making value-added products at the algae farm and felt like that was more my specialty. I kind of trusted that the other chips would fall into place, and they kind of have. We've been collaborating with farmers on Maui that are boosting their own cultivation processes, and talking to Jamie, who you had on the podcast, who's also trying to build a huge farm in North America that's kind of like a hub, kind of like a co-op model for supplying North America with mushrooms and mushroom extracts.
I was going to ask about that landscape of farmers and mushroom production because, I don't know a lot about this company, but Aloha Medicinals is so huge and they have so many strains of genetics. They would seem to be a pretty integral resource to creating maybe a mushroom system right there in Hawaii. I mean, you have this giant producer that's used heavily even on the mainland. It's supplying so many people with genetics and different things. So it seemed ripe to create an ecosystem there of farmers right in Hawaii.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And I would definitely love the opportunity to collaborate with someone along the sides of Aloha Medicinals. I know one of the farmers out here, Noah in Waimea, actually, he's consulting with John Holiday, the main gentleman behind Aloha Medicinals. And I've run into some of their team members on Maui. But I do know they kind of shifted operations. They relocated to, I believe, Las Vegas and kind of began to focus more on myceliated grain products. Okay. I believe they also sold the company. So who knows, like that can always come with a certain changing of mission and brand. But I would definitely want to, I guess, link up with them or someone similar to that to kind of create this large landscape of like maybe a cooperative model
that certainly changes the landscape a little if they're not down there anymore. So that's some kind of inside information that I didn't know about. But another question I had jumping around in my head, are there any folk stories in Hawaii about mushrooms?
Very good question. So the interesting thing, and you mentioned the Hawaii Mycoflora project before, which we'll get into.
I'm jumping around, but I just love folk medicine.
No, you're good. Stories. So a lot of work has not been done on like the endemic and native mushrooms of Hawaii. And I think a part of that is because there's not too much cultural history behind it. With things that there is some cultural history, genetics have shown it's with mushrooms that are actually relatively new to the island, so they're invasives. One you would know is the woodier mushroom, right? It's Auricularia cornea or something like that is a Latin name, but it actually looks like a little ear. It's in Hawaiian, it's called pepeau, which means ear. And the full name is actually pepeau akua, ear of the deity. So I talked to some professor at University of Hawaii who's specific in like cultural history, and he said he cannot find any history on it, but the fact that it is related to the deity or god makes him think it might have had some significance in Hawaiian culture. There's some interesting stuff there.
When you throw the word deity around, that kind of has some import, some gravitas associated with it. So it sounds like it was important. But that's interesting, though. There's not deep roots, necessarily tales of the mushroom, or even in some other cultures, you see fairy tales or things that may have veiled references to mushrooms. Just something I was really curious about. Well, just kind of getting back to Malama and what you're doing now.
Yeah.
What are some of the medicinal fungi that you guys use now, and maybe a little bit about the products you're making?
Right now, we're kind of leaning into the core four, as I call them. So like the reishi, ganoderma, the lion's mane, hericium, and cordyceps, ophiocordyceps, and last but not least, chaga, inonotus. So we're kind of leaning into those just because we know there's already a big interest in that in the global community of people seeking mushrooms. And we use powderized extracts that can be easily mixed into tea, coffee, smoothies sort of thing. We also make cacao mixes with them, so kind of like a pleasant hot cocoa, and then end up putting them in chocolate bars too. All sorts of different form factors and ways to use these functional foods into your everyday life.
I saw the chocolate. I was stoked on the chocolate. I haven't got a chance to try it. You know, we actually met here in Marin County at Good Earth Natural Foods. Shout out to Good Earth. So we can talk a little bit about where you're distributed, where the company's at, and then maybe if there's anything unique about sourcing or production processes and that kind of stuff you want to share.
Totally. I guess I started this like big push of the value-added product thing about like 2.5, 3 years ago. And I kind of just built it store by store myself. I got into a lot of the local stores here, and then I moved to the mainland for a little bit while the volcano out here was kind of going off and spewing her guts, and lived out of my truck and just kind of like went down the coast from Oregon store by store trying to see who would give us a shot. Stoked to say we're in about 70 stores, mainly in Hawaii and on the West Coast, from Portland down to San Diego. More focused definitely right now in the Bay Area. And yes, it was awesome to get to meet you in person at Good Earth. Marin County's such a magical place. And right now we make our products out here on the Big Island, and sourcing is always interesting. We're trying to empower our local farmers here to boost production so that we can use more locally grown mushrooms. But right now we do have a dependence on overseas cultivators and manufacturers. Definitely been using Jamie, who we mentioned, as a resource for helping us source some of the finest and highest quality extracts and mushroom powders that we can.
That's a big thing that I've been learning is overseas doesn't mean bad. It just means there's a responsibility on the producer to really navigate that whole supply chain from farmer to logistics, kind of transport to getting it over here. There's a lot of steps in that just puts the onus on the Benjamins of the world to make sure that it all comes together the right way. But I do know you guys are organic, so I would assume you source organic medicinals then.
Yeah, we're organically certified, and all of our suppliers are also, and then we also do some third-party test analysis on it as well, with navigating the heavy metals and pesticides and microbes to make sure that they're clean. We use a local lab out here for that.
All the big things that we all hope that people are doing to our food, and especially our supplements. You know, you talk about value added, you have this background in food systems. So what better person to navigate that and help build food systems? And that's what it sounds like. It sounds like you're using this again as a platform to empower other producers to come online and say, hey, we've got a home for your mushrooms if you get up to scale.
Yeah, that's the big thing is before I started this, trying to study how to be most impactful in Hawaii, is it's not a shortage of food, it's a shortage of distribution. You can have all the fruits in the world, but if there's no one to get them off the trees and get them on trucks and get them to a warehouse to be shipped, it's not going to move. Value-added products are growing. You know, people like resonating with brands that make them feel most like themselves. So it's kind of an interesting way to address the food systems.
And that's why I want to give a little background of where you're coming from. So for the people out there, so many people ask me, what are the good medicinals? What are the good processes? How do I? And it's hard for me to recommend any unless I have a podcast with them and I get to ask them these questions. I'm just really stoked to hear that that's kind of the ethos behind your products, because we've had them and like them, but it's good to hear that all those good things that we hope are happening, in terms of sourcing and supplying this medicine are indeed happening. And there's kind of a bigger goal here behind just having this great value-added product is development, exploration of kingdom fungi in general. So Hawaii Mycoflora, that's a perfect way to get into that. There may not be a big cultural heritage in Hawaii, but I think you're trying to do something to change that or flesh that out.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I did not come into the mushroom world at all taxonomist or didn't have too much foraging experience. And it wasn't until I mentioned I moved to the mainland for a year to kind of hustle Mālama mushrooms into several stores that I started to link up more with people, including, that's actually where I met Craig on one of your previous shows at the Radical Mycology Convergence. I believe it was 2018, just outside Portland, Oregon. And there I met a gentleman by the name of Christian Schwartz, who is one of the authors of Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast. And he was just this dude. He just like plopped up on the lawn in the sun with a stack of books, Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, which if any of you guys live on the West Coast, that is like the handbook right now.
It's a Bible.
It's the Bible, yeah. And he just posted up, he was not like really trying to sell them. So just like, yeah, man, what's your story? He's like, yeah, I'm selling this book. I'm like, you wrote this? He's like, yeah, co-wrote it. And
being too low key.
Yeah, clear example of the type of people you'll meet at a Radical Mycology convergence. And he gave a talk on what he's been doing in Santa Cruz, where he lives, citizen science there, and mapping the local mushrooms. And he just made a really good case for, we don't have enough data, but we have like the resources that everybody can be a major contributor to science. Even if they don't have any formal training, you don't need a degree. If you have a cell phone or just a way to take a picture, you can make a large contribution by taking pictures of mushrooms or whatever you see in the field. And in his case, he piggybacks off iNaturalist, which is an app people don't know. It not only logs your observation, but it can actually really help you make the identification with its suggestions. He really inspired me, and I realized that we needed to do this in Hawaii. There's been like 2 significant people that have worked on it out here. There's been one book written in, I think, early 2000s, and a lot has changed since then, and nobody's tracking it. Nobody's like keeping up to date on it. So me and my colleague, Jeff Stahlman, who's a university graduate out here, we decided that we wanted to take that on in our free cycles, and no one was going to pay us for it, but we ended up nailing a grant from the North America Mycoflora project, who is this non-profit that is solely dedicated to helping map the mushrooms of North America. We got a little grant for that just covered genetic testing costs for 50 samples, which ironically is the same number of potential endemic species in Hawaii, 50, and by endemic meaning potentially only found here.
You just said it perfectly about mycology being this nascent area of science. Everyone has a chance. Whenever something is big and new like this, and especially as vast as this, the amateur truly has a really important role. To think that there is also access to grants and systems where you can further that research means that there are more resources at your disposal to do this kind of exploratory work than one might think. If you could talk about it at all, a little bit about that process and maybe how you got involved with the North American Mycoflora project, just to inspire others who might want to do this in their area. They might not be in as genetically diverse a place as Hawaii, but maybe there's some resources people can tap into there.
Totally. Yeah, I definitely don't have like a big grant writing background or anything like that, so I'm not the guy to ask. And their process was relatively straightforward. It was kind of just like a fill-in form on their website, and luckily 2 of the main guys from there, actually 3 of them, because Christian Schwartz, the author I mentioned, is, I believe, a board member of that group.
Oh, perfect.
They were all at Radical Mycology Convergence, and I made an effort to annoy them and let them know, it was like, we need this in Hawaii. So that kind of worked. Hawaii is very unique, but there's so many places we don't have enough data on that aren't isolated, that are landlocked in the continental United States. So if I could give any advice to anybody, it would just be link up with your local group and see what kind of impact you can start having, and just have fun and learn, and the chips will fall into place.
People are always shocked. There's a whole community of mycophiles right under the surface when you start tapping into it, whether it's a radical mycology convergence, whether it's a local mycology club, because the universe is still, of this kind of interest group, is still relatively small for as big as the US is. Just keying into those groups, you'll start finding channels to kind of do more and more. And take Benjamin's example and annoy the key stakeholders until they give you access to the resources that you need. I think it is actually a great story of just showing up, being interested, being passionate. Doors will open, so don't let that be a barrier. Just showing up and talking to people. Mushroom people are nice, and they want to talk to you, and they want to bring you on the team.
Yes, well said. Every time I find myself in a mushroom community, which is, it's pretty rare in Hawaii, so it's always like in Telluride or, you know, in California somewhere, but it's just
Right.
like, those are my people. I just feel so at home. And yeah, like you said, people are very friendly, and chances you make a contribution are like in your favor. There's, I believe the statistic right now is like only 7% of the world's fungi has been characterized and discovered. So that's the entire kingdom, but that's 93% of this entire kingdom that has yet to be uncovered. So yeah, fungi, the final frontier.
Fungi, the final frontier. I love that. You sent that over in one of the notes before the show. I was like, that is so true. And that number is so stark. I mean, we're talking about it being this huge unexplored area, and nothing says it better than only 7% of them have even been discovered. That's insane. Now, I guess just getting into a little bit of the nitty gritty, now you got the grant, you got the inspiration to put together this project. What does the project look like? What kind of support maybe are you getting from any academics, any scientists involved, guiding kind of the collection procedures and the sequencing? Or is it kind of citizen science and you're going out foraging, sequencing yourself? What does this look like?
Totally. So the big picture, at least for me, is like taxonomy and characterizing these mushrooms is only step one, right? We characterize so that when we find something in the wild, we know this is this, and it might look the same as this other species, but they're genetically different. And I think for me, I'm always interested in like what's in them biochemically and their compounds. Talking about fungi, like penicillin is made from fungus. Heart statins are originally derived from fungus. The mushrooms we sell from Mālama Mushrooms are all have like hundreds of scientific studies on them, some human clinical, placebo-controlled, double-blind, that show their efficacy in helping humans. So I kind of am passionate about contribution they can make to society on a health level. That's kind of how I try to do our narration. But again, taxonomy is the first step. So from that grant, it was a lot of just Jeff and I going out there, making collections ourselves. You know, we just had like a bin full of these dried samples by the end of the year that I was like, all right, we got to pick 50 of these and sync them up with their iNaturalist observation, and we'll send them off to the lab, which the group we got the grant from had in, I believe, Iowa. So we sent them off and we got our first round of results. And now we're kind of like figuring out next steps. So are we going to try to get funding from like another nonprofit donor, or how to proceed? Because so far it's just him and I, and we've decided to change our Mālama Mushrooms. We've always given 5% of our profits to originally the Hawaii Children's Cancer Foundation, and now we're actually making it the Hawaii Fungi Project or Mycoflora Project, to the study and preservation of the native mushrooms here. So I'm trying to, you know, create our own funding source through our value-added product to contribute to that, and I'm also gearing up to begin asking people that might be interested in donating in the state of Hawaii and beyond. And to answer your kind of like university question, if we've had any help from them, we did get some interest from the local university. They helped us do some genetic characterization of a couple more samples. And there's some professors that are specifically studying some of the native and local mushrooms here with their antiviral, antibacterial components. Right now it's just doing it in petri dishes, but yeah, there's some local interest here.
Well, that's hugely inspiring because, like I said in the intro, there are a lot of compounds locked away in some of these mushrooms that we won't know until we explore them. Like for me, the project on its face, just identifying the native mushrooms, just the exercise itself, that's hugely valuable. But the
Right.
idea that further you can isolate compounds we haven't even heard of yet, haven't even found yet, because mushrooms are such amazing chemists, that makes it hugely exciting. And I would think that that's why I had that question about other involvement, because I would assume there have to be universities and things that are interested in exploring this just from a research kind of compounds perspective. And just a little bit about the foraging, just because I love the different kinds of foraging. I'm more of like a gourmet forager, so I'm looking for stuff that I know that I can eat. I'm unfortunately sometimes stepping over things that could be potentially amazing, or I think it's interesting when you're going at it from a taxonomical perspective. What does that foraging look like? I mean, do you have a tackle box out there, some pieces of paper where you're writing where you found it, and what is a little bit of that nitty gritty? Just because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, so a thing people are surprised about mushrooms in Hawaii is that if you've gone anywhere like Colorado or the East Coast or even California, it's quite underwhelming. It's surprising to hear, thinking of like the tropics, you would think things are just fruiting in abundance. And I think that's true. I've never been, but in South America, like the mushrooms there are amazing. But for whatever reason, probably because it's just such young land, Hawaii's, one of the youngest pieces of land in the world, the mushrooms have not gotten such a significant foothold here. So it's kind of like a joke, but in the native forest, you might be walking around for hours before you find like the tiniest little hygrospy growing on a fern. So it's definitely challenging. And when academic mycologists visiting here to help with any project, they're always like, man, this is fun, but it's tough because, what you find might be like a very, very rare mushroom that you're not going to find anywhere else in the world, like these little hygrospes. But yeah, you might be looking for hours just to find it. So from a gourmet, because I have that same interest when I'm on the East Coast or something, I love just finding like huge gourmets. But here it's like definitely a labor of love, a scientific pursuit. And yeah, it's a tackle box full of generally small, very small things.
Well, that's interesting to hear, because I think a lot of us do conjure up an image of, a rainforest or a tropical area. There must be a lot of, but I think you bring up a good point in that the land is younger. The soil ecology potentially is a lot younger, or not even soil yet when you're talking about volcanic rock. So the time for fungi to kind of take over and become really involved in the soil ecology, and especially develop mycorrhizal relationships. I was going to ask if there were any unique relationships with certain trees that you only find in Hawaii, but it sounds like maybe the land is so new and the biome is so new relative to other parts of the world that we just haven't seen those relationships develop yet.
Yep, I think you nailed it. Is they're still getting their arms around it, and actually, I think the only mycologist in Hawaii, University Hilo Manoa on the Oahu Island, they are specifically studying, I believe, endophytic fungi on a local tree called ohia, a native tree here, because that just like ultimately has more implications for protecting forests if you can understand the endophytic fungi there. So that has been more of the interest for academics here. So I'm happy to kind of fill that non-academic role of describing the mushrooms and contributing in that way.
So you talk about the world of endophytes. I mean, that opens a whole nother fascinating universe. I've heard things postulated that potentially a lot of medicinal properties we see in plants may actually be derived from their endophytic fungi. So I think that is a hot thing in mycology right now. So I'm not that surprised that's where they're focusing. But I think it's great that there's, again, a role for the amateur, a role for the citizen scientist to say, hey, we need to identify the fruit bodies. And you said there was an estimated probably 50 native fungal species?
50 endemic, which is like a step beyond native, probably hundreds native, but endemic meaning only found in Hawaii. So native and only found here.
Right, so only found in Hawaii. And is there one or two that come to mind that are really cool that we should know about?
Yes, so you'll appreciate this. So everything I just said about not having gourmets here, with the exception of a endemic litiparous species. So litiparous, for those that don't know, is chicken of the woods. It's the flame orange mushroom. It's like one of the only fleshy polypores. Many studies of medicinal benefits from, like, I believe, antibiologicals, antivirals, helps with cholesterol. And there's one that grows here, and it has been genetically sequenced, and it doesn't ping anything on MycoBank or in the system. So it has been identified as an endemic, but it hasn't been what's called described to give it its official name. And like that paper hasn't been written yet, but that's on my goal for 2020 is to have that sucker described by the end of the year.
Latiparus lillibridges?
No, we actually have a joke. Probably there's like a local dialect pidgin. That's where the word decine comes from, which means like the thing or the kind. So thinking Latiparus decanensis or something to play off a local pidgin slang.
Yeah, for anyone who's knows chicken in the woods, which I assume a lot of people do, absolutely stunning mushroom. I'm assuming similar color spectrum, that bright orange, that bright yellow.
Yeah, and I think some other things worth highlighting that are kind of on the opposite end of our recent work with the Mycoflora project. So now we've kind of getting a foothold on identifying the native and endemic things, but also now that we're tracking, we're seeing some of the new invasive things that weren't listed in the original field guide. So there's 2 cases of that. There's a gymnopus species that we see prolifically now in the native forest growing on the ferns. Without a doubt, I see it every time I go out, and it's growing like crazy. And then a Favolacia is the genus of this other one. It's like the orange pore mushroom. It's a tiny orange porous, go figure, mushroom. But I see that every time I go out, and it was not originally seen by the mycologist that wrote the Mushrooms of Hawaii book in early 2000s. So things are changing, and we don't know what that means, but it's good to monitor it because you can't manage what you don't measure. So
it sounds like it's a very dynamic landscape of mycoflora that's still developing. And we're in this era where no one's traveling right now, but I would imagine as more travel happens back and forth, which Hawaii is such a huge tourist destination, you're going to see more and more invasives as spores come in on people's clothing. So the landscape, from what I'm taking away from this, is the mycoflora landscape from Hawaii is still being shaped to this day in a huge way. I know you said you're kind of figure out exactly what direction you want to take, all that kind of thing, but is there any kind of end goalpost you're looking at? Like, hey, we want to publish a big research paper on this. We eventually want an updated field guide. Maybe we want to insubstantiate an organization here, like make the Mycoflora project more than just you guys and get some other volunteers involved and like create a running tracking of these kind of things?
Totally. That last one for sure is like, I kind of just want to create the foundation. I would love to just create jobs for people that, we have the USGS monitoring volcanic activity and like our bird people monitoring the local birds. And like, we need to have people monitoring the mushrooms. Absolutely. So that's definitely my goal, is to like make jobs for people that's what they do. And then hopefully carry through with identifying some of the native local compounds in those mushrooms. I'm totally open to publishing things. I definitely don't think that's my skill set. Jeff's more of the technical guy. And I think he's already drafting some overviews on the landscape here. And I know how much that can help. That needs to happen to push science forward, is like the publications. You don't have to be an academic to do it, but having those published. So I definitely want to see that happen. And that's it. Would love to have publications and jobs for other people doing this. And I would just look forward to a day where I can just like learn from these people that it's now their job to kind of keep track of this stuff.
That's awesome. And I just wonder too, if something like that happened and there was more of an extensive monitoring of the mycoflora there in Hawaii, it might be one of the few places we can watch a whole biome of mycoflora develop. I think of New Zealand as this incredibly diverse set of mycoflora that maybe has had more time to develop, and now we see this flourishing, all these wild looking like bright blue mushrooms, all these different things. So this may be the beginning of a similar process in Hawaii that it would be necessary for us to keep track of. And we talked about Craig a little bit, he talks so much about soil and gets me so interested in soil ecology, and you wonder if there can be discoveries made about potentially either introducing, or maybe fungi already are helping with that transition from that volcanic matter into soil. So I definitely think there's tons there to research as like this little microcosm that I hope this foundation gets started, and I really hope you're successful. I think we'll see a lot of interesting things come from that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. Makes me more stoked that you're stoked about it.
like you said, once you get papers out, it becomes this beacon for other people to share in the stoke and realize there is something to get stoked about here. So the Mycoflora project's kind of one element that's, again, part of this Malama platform. You're funding it. You're able to, really supercharge that effort. But another effort that we had on the radar was the Clarity project that before you sent it over, I didn't really know anything about. So what is the Clarity project? What are some of the goals there? And just tell us about it.
The Clarity project was started actually by a few activists on Oahu. Ashley Lucan, she was responsible for helping the non-GMO movement out here and banning some pesticide use. And so she's kind of been operating in this activism space. And she linked up with this gentleman, Robert, who wanted to have medical psilocybin legalized in Hawaii. And I've been in communication with like the Decrim Nature guys and the Decrim California guys. So I've always kind of been looking at this landscape and wanting to contribute, and just like couldn't find the bandwidth to do it myself. But then these guys started Clarity Hawaii and needed some help with communications, and I was already blasting about the benefits of mushrooms every day and like why people should care. So I think we just seemed like a good fit for that. So at this point, we've been just contributing to that movement out here in Hawaii and potentially expanding it nationwide. We're still kind of figuring it out, but in general, it's a local movement to getting people access to psilocybin therapy. As I'm sure people listening to this may know, it's been shown to help with PTSD and end-of-life anxiety and depression and all these things. So.
Well, you just hit on a couple of key points there. I was going to ask if you did have overlap with some of the other psilocybin groups and decriminalization movements. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you're not as much necessarily on the legislative side as on the personal or kind of patient side. Like, hey, we've seen, at least anecdotally, now emerging in clinical literature, the positive effects that can come from psilocybin. So we're trying to give people access. And really what's so all important is that safe space and support group to have responsible access to these substances and use them responsibly. Now, with that, do you guys, now I don't want you to say something that's like, shouldn't say or something like that, but are you giving people ceremony space and holding space like that? And if you are, is there any, like, not that there has to be, but is there any clinical component where you have any support from like a mainline lab or mainline research group, or is this purely like citizen led, which again is totally valid?
It's actually more like the original thing you said. We are actually more active legislatively right now with lobbying towards getting it looked at by the legislature. I personally am not. I don't do well on the political front, and so the kind of core group on Oahu's leading that effort. Unfortunately, everything's on recess right now just because of COVID-19. So we're just hammering away at community engagement, gathering people's experiences and testimonies, and just kind of creating a community network of people that have had beneficial experiences and or want to see it, accessible for them to have those beneficial experiences. So the group as a whole is definitely trying to work on a legislative level, and at this time they aren't doing any they're not holding space or ceremony or anything like that. If anybody is interested in those resources, I do believe everybody may know Trad Cotter is involved with something in Jamaica. I forget the name, it's like Blue something.
I've heard there's some efforts going on there in Jamaica to do that kind of thing. So I'm glad you just corrected me there, so I get my head around what the Clarity Project is instead of my projection of what it is. So I mean, it sounds like you're doing that all-important community building that groundswell for people to care about this legislatively, and developing, I always think of the anecdotal and community building, people sharing their stories, as really building this body of knowledge that you can return to, because it has been taboo, it has been prohibited. There is so much gray area in people's minds, and it really helps to crystallize it when you get this group of people coming together and sharing their experiences. It creates this central kind of body of knowledge, this central knowledge base where people can tap into and get a better sense of what this is, why they should care, and even help develop their own opinion, even if they're not for it. Hey, you at least have to look at this collective body of evidence, because otherwise there's no starting point for people. So I've seen that in a lot of groups here, just collecting. And when I've had someone on who's a clinical research in this, that's what they do. They take stories and anecdotal of it. Like, that's what we have.
Mm-hmm.
So sharing trip reports and personal experience is the body of knowledge we're going to develop on this, because even with all the clinical research going on, that's still kind of the go-to with something that is innately kind of affecting the consciousness. You have to go with the stories and the experiences.
I couldn't have said it better. And like, looking at the science, look at the papers, can't ignore it no matter what your personal bias is. Got to trust the science, and, look critically at the science, make sure the studies are conducted properly. But yeah, at the end of the day, when a result shows a result that can't be ignored, you got to pay attention to it. So
I think it also helps set those boundaries or their limits to what leads to a positive experience and what could potentially lead to a negative experience. And you only get that by people sharing their experiences and the surrounding circumstances to kind of derive as a community, okay, what works, what doesn't, what can we, I feel like that kind of makes the whole thing safer.
Absolutely. And I guess it would probably be a good idea to touch on safety with psilocybin. I'm sure you got nothing but veterans in your listening days, but yes, set and setting is a very important part of a healthy, positive psilocybin experience. So I think that's kind of my attraction to the legalization, decrim, or medical movements, is that it's whether you personally don't feel anxious about indulging in this beneficial, but albeit a federally illegal substance. I think a lot of people do have that anxiety and are just like a little on edge when they might partake in it, that it could compromise a otherwise super beneficial, life-changing experience. So yeah, safety is huge, and we want to make sure everybody has safe access.
Well, I really appreciate that caveat. And actually, for a lot of people that listen, I always preface this stuff with saying I am not the psilocybin or psychedelic expert, because there are so many people doing good work out there. I don't want people to think that I'm still learning. Totally. And this is kind of what I'm deriving, is the experiences are usually one of the most powerful experiences in someone's life. Often they're keystone or kind of seminal experiences people come back to. And there are takeaways like set and setting, like being around people you trust, having time afterward to integrate the experience, that we're all discovering now is kind of like common knowledge in those circles, but we're all discovering is like this codified way of using these substances. And I think we're watching citizen-led explorations into substances that may have been prohibited either prematurely and for, more devious reasons, like, hey, we don't want people to have these viewpoints. I just think it's a very interesting process to watch take hold, and I think what you're doing is a big part of that. So there are then multiple locations where, so clarity is bigger than just yourself. It's kind of an organization with multiple locations, multiple initiatives.
Exactly. And I think right now we're all kind of taking a look at the national landscape and wondering if it's bigger than Hawaii. But at this point, we are kind of focused in Hawaii.
Here on the mainland in Oakland and Santa Cruz and Denver, those are the big places where there have been city resolutions passed. Has there been campaigns to do that in Hawaii? And has there been any receptive people that you found within city councils and that kind of thing?
Somewhat. Surprised to hear that Hawaii is a little more conservative in some ways than one might expect. People think like super cruise, like beach life, but with some things they aren't so much. And take a look at the marijuana movement here. It took forever just to get medical here, and we still only have medical marijuana here. It doesn't look like it's going to go to recreational use anytime soon, and it took probably like 8 years from when they approved it for like everybody to get on board and get things moving. So I think here in Hawaii, the medical movement is kind of a pointed strategy for this culture. And in Oakland, I think like the decriminalized movement was perfect. I really love what those guys did with putting everything, plants, fungus, into the mix there. And they're very resolute in their mission that I really appreciate. In some ways, I know they may not be stoked completely on just the medical movement, because then it kind of makes black market users, now they're marginalized in a way, which I appreciate that viewpoint immensely. But I do think for it to get anywhere in Hawaii, it's probably going to have to go through the medical first. And to me, it's like if a police officer finds you with something that has medical efficacy in that state, they're going to definitely like not feel as, I guess, aggressive towards that substance. They're going to have to acknowledge that it does have medical use. So
That's the big thing for me, is kind of calming down the rancor of the legislative and enforcement side of things. I'm always against that. I think that's really the biggest harm that comes out of a lot of the prohibition through whatever vector. If it is taking a stand to say, hey, from just a philosophical perspective, all of these should be decriminalized. They're substances out in nature. Or if you have to work through a vector because of the surrounding system to say, hey, this is a medical, and you kind of work things that way. I think for me, the end goal that's really positive is lowering the amount of harms that come from unjust incarceration, that come from really affecting people's lives, for exploring substances that, let's face it, have prominent subcultures in our country. You know, there are whole movies and constant jokes, and everyone has experiences with it. So can we please stop putting people in cages? So I think anything that gets us closer to that, whether or not you're not sold on its effects, or let's stop putting people in cages for a substance we can all agree is not ruining society. You know, it's rated as one of the least harmful substances. So that move, whether it's through health or through the more kind of militant philosophical angle, I think the outcome is all positive. So you got to deal with the reality of where you are.
Yes. Yep, exactly. And, you know, maybe that's what the Clarity Project could bring to, when I mentioned a national movement, is kind of, you know, working with the local community in different cities and kind of helping them pivot and adjust to what their culture and their legislative like general theme is, and kind of helping create or give a toolkit for picking the lock and getting a foot in there.
Yeah, exactly. I love that when it's the idea that it's like a template. You develop this narrative that people can mirror in other places to great effect. That's really cool to hear that you're doing that work. Like I said, I had no idea about that. It was enough just to talk about all your work with medicinals, all the work there in Hawaii, but that was like this added bonus because I've just been interviewing a couple people about psilocybin, again, doing my own education. So it's really fun to add this to that whole conversation. I guess something I did leave out when we were talking about Hawaii, are you finding diversity in fungal species between some of the islands there in Hawaii? That's a big question I had, because you're a big island, which I think of as very diverse because it has beach, the upper kind of highlands there, Waimea, and then you have the rainforest. I guess, are you finding diversity between islands, or is the project kind of centered in a couple places right now, or one place?
Totally. That's a great question. And I'll start with the caveat is like, again, just hammering this idea that there like hasn't been enough work done on this to know for sure. And when they wrote the initial field guide, I mean, they actually covered all the islands, and like I'm surprised by how thorough Don Hemis and Dennis Desjardins at UCSF actually covered the islands on foot, and they did a great job. But at the end of the day, you know, they're just two guys like out here a few months, or Dennis was only out here a few months out of the year, and so who knows what they didn't see. But you're right that the Big Island is unique. So the Big Island seems to have much more native forest vegetation, which in the case out here yields more native fungi and native mushrooms. That is one reason I like the mycological scene out here on the Big Island. Now, Oahu, which for those that don't know is where Honolulu is and has, you know, a population of like 1 million plus people and millions of tourists per year, I think there's way more reports of like unique and diverse invasives that are popping up there.
Which would make sense.
Talking, yeah, and you're talking about earlier is like, you know, we're all kind of watching the ecology of Hawaii soil before our eyes, and that's definitely the case with observing invasive species and people traveling here. It's a petri dish in a lot of ways, the incubation chamber for what people bring here. So Oahu's would be a very interesting place to see that, but there are definitely reports of certain things on the Big Island that like haven't been seen elsewhere, and I think the same can be said for example, there's an Amanita muscaria that grows on only Kauai Island. I believe it's only been reported on Kauai. Oh, wow. So yeah, there's a few little nuances here and there.
No, that's interesting, and it sounds like another one of those questions that'll be answered through continued exploration. Yes. Well, I guess we've been talking a little over an hour, so I do want to talk about some of the future plans. both in the context of Mālama, Mycoflora, and Clarity. Why don't we start with Mālama, though? What is kind of in the future for Mālama? More value-added products? We've talked some about that, but what's the future look like?
We're continuing with like product development, nurturing our customer base right now. So like we have an email list that we send people weekly and sometimes daily, like information or updates on our product, doing giveaways and promos. So now after like hustling in a truck on the mainland for a year or two, I'm kind of like enjoying being more introspective and working from a computer more and nurturing the online community, especially now with COVID-19 that I don't really have an option. My sister's come on board and she's a talented video editor and video shooter. So we're kind of creating more video content that's fun and educational at the same time, sinking more back into that, all the while kind of nurturing our partnerships out here with local farms and trying to work with them to boost local cultivation here. Because at the end of the day, I would like to see us vertically integrated in 5 years. So that's kind of like a goal of mine, is to be growing enough of these mushrooms, reishi, lion's mane, to supply our own product. So that's kind of the Mālama front.
As any entrepreneur knows, when you're talking about vertical integration, it's kind of like chicken or the egg. You need to make sure you are developing that consumer base. So when you do make that investment to get people online to produce for you, you always got a home for it. It's a juggling act, and I respect you for doing it. And I think it's really exciting to watch people do this, because so much of the demand is here in the United States, especially the emerging demand is in, I think, a lot of Western countries, US and Britain in particular. I've heard it's the shroom boom. So it would be great to think that there are local producers that are going to benefit from that demand in a huge way. And it's always nice hearing that's kind of the end goal. So in terms of the Mycoflora project, I know we covered that. So you've kind of got plans for the future there that you're working towards. And then I guess what is next in line for Clarity? Is it kind of more grassroots organization? Are there any big pushes or deadlines in terms of initiatives or anything we need to know about?
Nothing that is solid right now. We were going to be like making our effort in the legislation before COVID-19, but now that that's on hold, our plans are kind of on hold for that front. So all the meanwhile, we're just going to continue generating content and engaging with the community, just see how we can be useful and see how we can serve the movement.
It's about getting the word out. It's always a big effort to get information out there, especially now when there's more noise than ever. And that's why I think for all these things we're talking about, there can never be enough voices to kind of spread the word and inoculate more minds and get people interested in mushrooms, because I think people that do get interested inevitably see how beneficial it is. So,
and on that note of inoculating the minds, I just want to again acknowledge you for doing just that with a lot of people out there. I didn't tell you this, but I don't spend a lot of time in Los Angeles, but I was there in the beginning of March. I was on a hike in Topanga Canyon. I was like finding mushrooms, and this group of hikers saw me and they're like, "Oh, you should check out Welcome to Mushroom Hour." And I was like, "What?" I'm like, "I know that guy."
No way. That's amazing.
Shout out to those LA aspiring mycologists.
Those LA hikers. Nice work, guys. Thanks for the support. Well, I guess then, is there anything else we're forgetting? Anything you wanted to make sure to mention? Anything really cool or inspiring you want to get out there?
The world of mycology can seem kind of overwhelming at first in a lot of ways, sure. From the taxonomy to just like getting out there and looking for stuff. Like I didn't know where to begin for the longest time. Find the people that are doing it already and like link up with them. They're harmless, or just get out there and start looking. Like after rainfall, like do some Googling, find out when things fruit in your local area. And with your cell phone, like I taught myself how to identify things just from using a cell phone and like iNaturalist or any sort of app, and just identifying with what the database could show me and doing subsequent research and like looking up medicinal compounds and edibility and doing all that. The technology is amazing and people are amazing. So use both, but also use a beautiful brain and don't eat anything that you're unsure of.
Rule number 1, get out there and start looking, but don't even think about eating your first few times. Just go out and explore. And never been a better time to be an autodidact, because there is so much information, and because we don't have a choice. We can't be with people right this second. But I have to get on iNaturalist. I've had a couple people now, including Gordon Walker, a bunch of people just say iNaturalist is where to be. So I don't know how I'm not on that party yet. I gotta get on the iNaturalist.
It's fun, man. It becomes its own little sub community. You're like looking at how many observations you have. It's super nerdy.
Well, yeah, and it sounds like it's a place too where you can low key kind of stalk people's mushroom spots.
Yes, that is a thing. There is a geotag function. So if you find your chanterelle patch, don't or do upload it and tell me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just tell us when you're uploading that patch. So where can people find more about you, about any of these projects, websites, socials, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so I would say Mālama Mushrooms is kind of the main platform of expression for me and our team on the Mālama mushroom front. And for those that I didn't mention, Malama is the Hawaiian word for protect, preserve, and nurture. So that's kind of what we say serves as the standard for all the work we do with mushrooms, is they help protect and preserve us, and we're attempting to try to do that with them. We have an Instagram, Mālama Mushrooms, Malama Mushrooms, plural. You can find us on there. We're always posting fun content, and we have a website of the same name. And then, yeah, everybody feel free to reach out, whatever questions from this episode. I'm an open book, happy to talk, and we give like a free chocolate and 20% off our first orders if you subscribe to our email list. So that's a thing if you guys like free chocolate. And Darren, I'm going to be sending you a little care package in the mail shortly.
Oh, that's too kind. We'll have to do an exchange then. I'll send you a bunch of little Mushroom Hour merch and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm the winner because I get chocolate. I think I came out on top on that one. And then just a couple final thoughts to give us a little more insight into Benjamin. What is a mushroom that you love and why? It doesn't have to be a favorite. It doesn't just a cool mushroom. Why you love it?
I'm going to go with the Litiparus for me, just because Chicken of the Woods was like one of the first gourmets I ever found when I was just learning to mushroom. And, you know, it's so distinct and like you can't really mix it up with anything. And it's delicious and it has medicinal compounds. And then when I found out it was an endemic species here in Hawaii, I just got extremely stoked. So I'm going to go with that one for my favorite. It's nothing crazy rare in the global scheme of things, but it's one of my favorites.
You know, I didn't actually know about the medicinal compounds, so that's new to me. That's fantastic, because for me, Chicken of the Woods is always about breading and frying into little vegan fried chicken. But to know that it's medicinal now means I can eat as much of that as I want, and it's good for me.
Yes.
Well, and then this whole body of work we've talked about, obviously a lot of inspiring stuff going on. What do you hope the lasting impact is of your body of work?
That's a good question. I mean, for the Malama front, I want to have a significant positive impact on agriculture in Hawaii, and also have a rad brand that people can resonate with and trust and get their everyday mushroom goodness. So that's kind of that front, the Malama front. The Clarity Hawaii project front, which is the psilocybin project, is I want to see people have access to psilocybin and not feel guilty about using it. And I think a lot of us around our age, it's like, yeah, I don't feel guilty using it, but you know, there's a older demographic of people that would very much benefit from it and do feel guilty or have a lot of baggage with it. So ultimately, I want my parents to feel comfortable doing it and be stoked at the prospect of having a guided journey that helps them heal. So that's for those two. And then with the Mycoflora project, yeah, it would be so cool to just, you know, make Hawaii mushrooms as much of a household word as like Hawaii coconuts or mac nuts or Kona coffee. It's like, I think this place has some very unique things happening here and deserves to be acknowledged by the scientific community. And I would love to be an assistant in bringing that to light and empowering a group of local citizens out here to take that on as their life's work or as their master's thesis, and just inspire a new generation of citizen scientists that are stoked to study and contribute.
It's all about the gift of stoke, and it sounds like the goal is really to be an effective steward of the mushroom in so many ways. I'm really excited to hear about all this. Like I said, I'll be excited to follow your journey, and definitely sounds like you're open for people to reach out. So if any of these things interest you, you know, especially like from the research angle, that kind of thing, if you need inspiration, I'll have all the links where to find you, all that good stuff. But Ben, thank you so much for making the time during what is a crazy time for everyone. Thank you for making the time and coming and dropping in.
Absolutely, Darren. Thank you so much again for holding space and creating this awesome platform. And yeah, man, keep it up. Everybody loves what you're doing.